Hello, my name is Hunter Donahue, and I'm going to go over 3 of Thomas Hardy's most well-known poems, including Neutral Tones, During Wind and Rain, and The Darkling Thrush. During this presentation, I will be referring to the literary critics and writers on this list. Please refer back to these sources for more information on Thomas Hardy's poetry. Thomas Hardy coined 234 words for his enormous collection of poetry, well over 900 poems. Words that are most commonly used in Hardy's poetry include pale, sad, bleak, gloom, dim, vast, measureless, infinite, firmament, profound, blankness, mechanic, mindless, diurnal, pulse, phantom, ghost, spirit, and wraith. Hopefully, that gives you some idea of what his poetry is like. In general, it's pretty dark. There are several really great examples of a sense of hope, however, in some of Hardy's poetry. He believed that you could improve the human condition through effort, although many of his characters seem to fall victim to fate or victim to their own impulses. The first poem I'm going to talk about is Neutral Tones. Neutral Tones is a dramatic monologue about a failed relationship. Most of the critics agree that it is a pessimistic poem with a bleak outlook on love. This is a poem which is not interested in epiphanies or revelations. Hardy is more interested in giving us a larger and more realistic picture of human experience and the human process of learning. In Hardy's world, according to Susan Miller, knowledge generally comes too late, or slowly, over time in pieces. Neutral Tones is made up of 4 quatrains. Each quatrain has 3 tetrameter lines and a final trimeter line. The scheme is A, B, B, A, C, D, D, C, etc. This means that the first and last lines of each quatrain rhyme, as do the second and third lines. According to Mary Oliver, tetrameter lines evoke a sense of haste and severity, even discomposure or irritation. The trimeter line can feel even more urgent, moving the poem along and creating a sense of dread. I'm going to read the poem once in its entirety, and then I'm going to break it down and go through it with you line by line, or stanza by stanza. We stood by a pond that winter day, and the sun was white as though chidden of God, and a few leaves lay on the starving sod. They had fallen from an ash and were gray. Your eyes on me were as eyes that rove over tedious riddles of years ago, and some words played between us to and fro, on which lost the more by our love. The smile on your mouth was the deadest thing, alive enough to have strength to die, and a grin of bitterness swept thereby, like an ominous bird a wing. Since then, keen lessons that love deceives and rings with wrong have shaped to me your face and the God-cursed sun and a tree and a pond edged with grayish leaves. In the first stanza of Neutral Tones, Hardy sets up a dreary landscape. The sun has been drained of all of its energy, like everything else in the scene. It's winter. And a few leaves lay on the starving sod. They had fallen from an ash and were gray. So the earth itself is described as starving, and the leaves on the ground are like ashes. A lot of attention is placed on the prosaic details of the scene around the man and woman, but not much attention is given to the actual relationship itself. Laura Cowan argues that this is one of the ways that the poem resembles modern poetry. Modern poetry tends to put more importance on the mundane details. The lack of detail about the relationship really draws you in and makes you wonder, what happened? And also, the landscape can become a metaphor for the relationship. Your eyes on me were as eyes that rove over tedious riddles of years ago, and some words played between us to and fro, on which lost the more by our love. Hardy actually changed the line here from tedious riddles solved years ago in its first printing to tedious riddles of years ago, almost as if to banish the hope of ever coming to satisfied conclusions. You may have noticed that most of the words in Neutral Tones are clipped and only 1 or 2 syllables, short words. This brings more attention to the words with more syllables. Here, the word tedious has 3 syllables. The smile on your mouth was the deadest thing, alive enough to have strength to die. Here again we have a suggestion of a lack of vitality and a confusing, contradictory description, which suggests a loss of coherence on the part of the speaker. And a grin of bitterness swept thereby, like an ominous bird a wing. Here, the word ominous jumps out because it has 3 syllables. Also, bitterness. According to Laura Cowan, this is also a departure from Romantic poetry in the use of a bird as a threatening omen. The bird is a metaphor for the unhappiness that the woman is going to cause him. In Romantic poetry, birds are more often positive images and a welcome inspiration for the poet or artist. So that's how this is different from Romantic poetry. Okay, so the 3 words with 3 syllables are tedious, bitterness, and ominous, and these 3 words also serve to describe the relationship. In the last lines of the last stanza, we are taken into the future of the speaker. Since then, keen lessons that love deceives and rings with wrong have shaped to me. According to Susan Miller, the words since then create a distance between us and the scene by the pond. Laura Cowan argues that this also shows us that the lessons learned from this failed relationship have been applied to all love in general. The experience has been painful, and Cowan says this is emphasized by the use of words that evoke physical pain, like rings and keen. Your face, and the God-cursed sun, and a tree, and a pond edged with grayish leaves. Throughout the poem, a large number of anapests and dactyls serve the function of breaking up the flow of the poem and slowing the reader down. Trochees, which Cowan calls downbeats, also contribute to a sense of stumbling and uncertainty. The atmosphere of this poem is very bleak. The next poem that I'm going to talk about is called During Wind and Rain. This poem gives you just a brief impression of the family life of Hardy's late wife, Emma. These images were pulled by Hardy from writings that she left behind after her death. Some critics place more importance on this fact and the circumstances surrounding the relationship than others. During Wind and Rain has 4 stanzas, each 7 lines long. The same form is repeated. The last 2 lines of each stanza act as a counterpoint to the 5 lines before it. The duality inherent in the poem is reinforced by the rhyming of the first and last lines of each stanza. They sing their dearest songs, how the sick leaves reel down in throngs. See how songs and throngs rhyme? This ties the 2 images together, despite the fact that they contrast with each other. The poem is filled with all sorts of symmetry. I'm going to read it through one time, and then go through it line by line. They sing their dearest songs, he, she, all of them, yea, treble and tenor and bass, and one to play, with the candles mooning each face. Ah, no, the years, oh, how the sick leaves reel down in throngs. They clear the creeping moss, elders and juniors, making the pathways neat and the garden gay, and they build a shady seat. Ah, no, the years, see the white storm birds wing across. They are blithely breakfasting all, men and maidens, yea, under the summer tree, with a glimpse of the bay, while pet fowl come to the knee. Ah, no, the years, oh, and the rotten rose is ripped from the wall. They change to a high new house, he, she, all of them, clocks and carpets and chairs on the lawn all day, and brightest things that are theirs. Ah, no, the years, down their carved names the raindrop plows. In the second stanza, you can see that we definitely have a pattern set up now. The lives of the family, contrasted with something vaguely ominous. The first 3 lines of each stanza are in trimeter, for the most part, but when we get to the 4th line, there's a change. Whenever there's a sudden change in a poem, that's when you should pay attention. Each 4th line is in dimeter, meaning that it only has 2 feet, or 2 stresses. This unexpected change sounds unfinished, as if the line is falling short of something. It may even suggest disappointment. The whole poem is meticulously symmetrical in many ways. The first line of each stanza uses some kind of alliteration. Sing their dearest songs, clear the creeping moss, and, in the next stanza, blithely breakfasting. The last lines of each stanza are metrically identical to each other, but Hardy's use of rhythmic variation makes them seem different. It also has the effect of moving the reader forward through the poem. Donald Davies refers to it as a continuous unfolding. So even though each last line is in iambic tetrameter, they read very differently, and you're propelled through the poem. Also notice each time the members of the family are mentioned, it is as he, she, or they. No one is mentioned by name, and each scene is just a brief moment flashing by. This perspective makes sense when you remember that these are not Hardy's own memories, and this isn't his family. In the fourth stanza, it gets really dark. They change to a high new house. He, she, all of them, clocks and carpets and chairs on the lawn all day, and brightest things that are theirs. Ah no, the years, down their carved names the raindrop plows. It took me a couple times of reading the very last line before I realized that it is referring to carved names on a tombstone or a gravestone. The poem can be interpreted in more than one way. Samuel Hines, among others, sees the poem as a reminder that death always triumphs, and there can be no resolution or reconciliation between the two worlds embodied in the poem. Others may see it in a more positive way, as a reminder that life is precious and short, and the fact that death is around the corner for all of us can really emphasize how important life is. The next poem I'm going to talk about is called The Darkling Thrush. According to Geoffrey Harvey, this poem is a lament of the death of God and of nature. It is generally accepted as being about the turn of the century, the year 1900, and the changes that were happening at the time due to the Industrial Revolution. The poem is made up of 4 stanzas, each with 8 lines, and is metrically consistent iambic tetrameter. This rigid form contrasts with the decline and entropy contained in its imagery. This may serve to highlight the difference between the poet and the thrush, introduced later in the poem. Like I did with the other 2 poems, I'm going to read through this one in its entirety and then break it down. I leant upon a coppice gate when frost was spectre gray, and winter's dregs made desolate the weakening eye of day. The tangled vine stems scored the sky like strings of broken lyres, and all mankind that haunted nigh had sought their household fires. The land's sharp features seemed to be the century's corpse outleant, his crypt the cloudy canopy, the wind his death lament. The ancient pulse of germ and birth was shrunken hard and dry, and every spirit upon earth seemed fervorless as I. At once a voice arose among the bleak twigs overhead, in a full-hearted evensong of joy illimited. An aged thrush, frail, gaunt, and small, in blast-beruffled plume, had chosen thus to fling his soul upon the growing gloom. So little cause for carolings of such ecstatic sound was written on terrestrial things afar or nigh around, that I could think there trembled through his happy good-night air some blessed hope whereof he knew, and I was unaware. You may have noticed that some of the words are capitalized when normally they wouldn't be. This is a type of personification, and raises certain nouns in the poem to a higher status, and lends them extra significance. Thrush is not capitalized, however. This is significant and places the thrush on a sort of equal footing with man. They're both mortal, frail creatures. The rhyming scheme of the Darkling Thrush is formulaic and traditional A-B, A-B, C-D, C-D. In the first stanza, Hardy makes it clear that this is a bleak winter scene during the twilight hours of the day. Winter is capitalized and personified, as well as frost. The landscape's suggested colors are black, white, and gray. The I in the first line, the speaker, is never described in too much detail, but is generally thought of as a very depressed poet. This lack of detail makes it easier for the reader to identify with the speaker. This helps lend the poem a kind of universalism. Notice that the day itself is also personified, and it has a weakening eye. The tangled vine stems scored the sky like strings of broken lyres. A lyre is a classical Greek instrument, so this simile suggests a loss of the classical, old ways of doing things. The whole poem gives you a sense of the decline of the state of things. The land's sharp features seem to be the century's corpse outlent, his crypt the cloudy canopy, the wind his death lament. It makes sense that Hardy would personify the century, since that is what the poem is about, the death of the century. This is one of the less challenging of Hardy's poems, because he really hits you in the face with his metaphors and his depressing tone over and over again. By the way, outlent is a word that Hardy made up, one of many. The landscape can be seen as a metaphor for the state of mind of the speaker, whose perception is twisted and marred by hopelessness. Hardy was probably thinking about all the changes occurring due to the Industrial Revolution when he wrote this poem. People are described as spirits who haunt a desolate, gray, industrial landscape. At once a voice arose among the bleak twigs overhead, in a full-hearted evensong of joy limited. An aged thrush, frail, gaunt, and small, in blast beruffled plume, had chosen thus to fling his soul upon the growing gloom. First, let's look at this stanza as all one piece. It's the first stanza that is not broken up into two sentences. This line gives the poem a feeling of opening up. The joyful thrush is here to relieve the gloomy suffering experienced by the speaker, who at this point is standing outside in the cold, wallowing in how miserable everything is. The thrush, even though it's frail and old and disheveled, is still choosing to express joy, so the poem seems to have some optimism in the face of a cold, gray world. The thrush could be seen as a symbol of nature's anticipation of spring and new growth, which is as inevitable as death and winter. Line 21 is the one line that stands out in the otherwise metrically consistent poem. An aged thrush, frail, gaunt, and small. Louise Donner points out that the words frail and gaunt are both heavily accented syllables. They're set off by organic structural pauses within the lines called a caesura. So little cause for carolings of such ecstatic sound was written on terrestrial things afar or nigh around. The speaker makes it pretty clear that he doesn't see any reason anywhere in the dismal landscape to be singing joyfully, or any reason to have hope. The speaker is puzzled by the thrush's audacity. Some critics choose to view it still as a connection gained between the thrush and the speaker, leaving open the possibility of future reconnection with the hope and joy in himself. That I could think there trembled through his happy good-night air some blessed hope whereof he knew, and I was unaware. The last stanza is all one sentence, without even a semicolon to slow us down, so it's like we're gaining momentum. Notice that the word hope is our last personified concept, and so it's given particular importance. The speaker does acknowledge that hope might exist, but he fails to embrace it completely by using the word could. He could think that there's a reason to hope, but he isn't aware of that reason, and so he doesn't really believe it. That is the way that Susan Butterworth sees it, but other critics, like Louise Donner and Geoffrey Harvey, see it as a celebration of the joy that could come from within, despite circumstances. Thank you for listening. I hope this presentation was helpful to you.